Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today has been one of the pioneers of the human development movement, as it's been often described. He founded the Esalen Institute, which did monumental and exploratory work in bringing about a synthesis between Eastern systems of philosophy, of introspection, and the Western emphasis on action. He's been described as one of the key catalysts of contemporary culture. He's written extensively, 4 novels and numerous works of non-fiction. He's co-authored a book on God and the universe. He's written on the future of the human body. And I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Michael Murphy.
Pleasure to be here.
Neo-Aurobindonian. You come back to India after 50 years, after time that you spent at the Aurobindo ashram, which was a turning catalytic moment. When you talk about the human potential, of course, Sri Aurobindo was writing extensively on this very subject,
right.
and taking it beyond everyday mundane consciousness to the phrase he used, supraconsciousness,
right.
and integral yoga.
Right.
What has your work in that context been in the last several decades?
First of all, Sri Aurobindo, more than any thinker, any saint, mystic, shaped the foundations of my thought, my aspiration, when I was just a sophomore at Stanford University and got into a class by mistake taught by a great professor of comparative religions and heard the word Brahman. In a certain way, that was the end of my Christianity, and then Atman Brahman. But then, at the end of that course, came a presentation of the work of Sri Aurobindo, and I read The Life Divine that summer. And his vision of the entire cosmos as the unfoldment of the divine, the coherence of his philosophy, the boldness of it, the fertility of it, that inspired me to give up all the aims and aspirations my family had projected on me. I had been a very good student, etc. And led me to come to the Sri Aurobindo ashram, 1956-57, and then go back to the United States and start the Esalen Institute. Since then, many other influences have come into my life, but it's fair to say I am a neo-Aurobindonian. I don't buy every item of his thought, as I'm sure he wouldn't either. His thought was constantly evolving.
The Esalen Institute has been home, of course, to providing a context for your own interest and your own spirituality and your own journey. But it has also been a meeting ground where diversity has been welcomed and embraced and created the context for a whole range of diverse approaches to experiment, to be, to engage. You're identified, certainly, very closely, in a sense, with the human development movement, which is, in many ways, in the context of Western civilization, or Western vocabulary, sought to expand the space of the internal universe, and to use that as terms of reference for external action. You have written a book on the future of the human body, for example. So what is the future? What are the limits of human potential? We normally associate that with physical things. We say you can run this fast, or the mind can produce empirically electronics and a vision of outer space and what have you. But what is the inner universe?
Well, we're in this historic moment. We are living through a redefining of human nature, and it's multi-leveled. Let's take just from at the physical level. Quantum physics introduced consciousness into matter from the point of view of physics. Now, there have always been philosophers, going back to the Upanishads, and certainly in the Western tradition, the panpsychic tradition, that says subjectivity is there everywhere. Leibniz, Alfred North Whitehead. In other words, even the inanimate world has some degree of subjectivity. And the great German idealist philosophers, Schelling and Hegel, kind of announced to the world that the Deus implicitus, the divine that is implicit in all things, everywhere and always, in the course of time is evolving into the Deus explicitus. The divine is manifesting. Now that idea has now permeates the so-called human potential movement, that the body itself is filled with these extraordinary potentials, and it finds common voice increasingly in the world of sport. People aren't quite aware of how pervasive sport psychology is.
Well, you've written this definitive book almost on golf.
Well, yeah. Well, I started something with that book. I mean, some people know me mainly for that book. It was a mystical tale, but it turned to be much towards, it's become the best-selling fiction ever written about the game of golf. Okay, so the physical world is been revealed to be filled with consciousness by leading thinkers now. It's no longer a metaphysical idea out on the wings. It's here in front of us. Okay, the psyche, the human psyche, its basements, let's call it, were opened up by Sigmund Freud. The wings of this immense house have been opened up by Carl Jung, Abraham Maslow, who used to come to our ashram, Carl Rogers, countless psychologists, East and West, Stan Grof, whom you know, opened up door after door of the human psyche. The vistas of spirit, in other words, to conceive the beyond, the more, the divine, as a vast frontier for exploration. No contemplatively gifted philosopher has opened that up more than, I believe, than Sri Aurobindo, who created a new language to talk about where we go from here in a yogic sense. When he said, to the alarm of many thinkers, that his yoga began with nirvana, you know, that didn't go down well in certain circles. Aldous Huxley said, well, it's certainly all right for Sri Aurobindo to say his yoga began with nirvana, but for the rest of us, it will end with nirvana.
You know, the Esalen Institute, and you alluded to your work, and with the U.S.-Soviet relations, and I mentioned hot tub diplomacy, has had some manifestations, some expressions of social action.
Yes.
But I think there's people like Carl Rogers have expressed grave concern and fear that the human potential, the human development movement, has sometimes gotten too obsessed with itself,
Right.
and has and become self-centered to the
Right.
exclusion of the rest of human action, social action,
Yeah.
and the interdependence of
Well, I have to defend our right to explore within. It's very hard in the West to sit down and meditate without being called selfish. Muscular Christianity, that is, you go to church and you go right out and do a good deed. Now, this is a great force in the world. But the greatest teachers, like Mother Teresa, would make her sisters working in the slums of Calcutta, when they're fatigued, go and pray. The Dalai Lama, as much as anybody, on the planet, to combine the contemplative and the active. So, God forbid that Esalen Institute stand up for people learning how to meditate, to inquiring into their motives, following the example of Socrates, to know thyself. God forbid in America we do such a thing for more than 10 minutes. I was raised Episcopalian, and you were allowed to pray for 10 minutes, that's it, in my church. Then you're out doing good works. Now, this is wonderful, wonderful. But Protestant America has no contemplative tradition. So, I have to stand up for the human potential movement and say the balance of the inward and the outward is what the human soul aches for. It aches for this. And that, I loved Carl Rogers. He was wonderful. And there's certainly people I can think of who come to Esalen Institute who are very self-preoccupied. You know, we made a rule. We're only going to allow people to come to 200 seminars.
You're watching a conversation with Michael Murphy, one of the pioneers of the human potential movement. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Michael Murphy. You talked about, Aurobindo as this inspiration. Don't you think he was too somewhat inner-directed when he began his more serious sadhana, and we didn't see certainly externalized action? And how do you weave that?
Well, first of all,
into...
he's one of the fathers of modern India. It would be as if Thomas Jefferson suddenly had the contemplative gifts of Sri Ramakrishna. You know, it's hard to think of many figures in human history who are both as catalytic to the birth of a nation and as contemplative gifted and being a major philosopher at the same time.
Do you find it some sort of ironic that you come back to India after 50 years, and this is, at least visibly, does this seem like a country now trying to sort of follow in the footsteps of the West? And that really seems contemporary aspiration rather than the ashram that you sought out 5 decades ago.
I'm thrilled by contemporary India. Is it a bad thing that 250 million people have joined the middle class in 25 years? In India and China, this has never happened in human history. I personally am happy that the freeway system in and around Delhi is so magnificent. It's as handsome as anywhere in America. I'm happy there are 8 lanes and 10-lane freeways, and the Lodi Gardens are so gorgeous. I mean, this is healthy. For me, this is marvelous. Now, I'm sure, I know, there are all the terrible challenges India will face that America is facing. We're in it together. Environmental degradation, the overwhelming poverty, but it's at least 250 million people more are in the middle class.
So what for you is this balance between exploring the inner universe that we talked about and sort of the gratifications of the material world? And in a sense that, when I refer to Carl Rogers, that was what he was complaining about in many ways. Not just the fact that people were sitting and meditating and exploring the inner consciousness, but it was leading to a heightened sense of self. And a diminished sense of social responsibility, where the otherness of the other will also dissolve.
William Blake, the roads of excess lead to the palaces of wisdom. We can't control humans. We're a very spirited, adventurous race. And people will make mistakes, but we're growing up. We're learning how to do this. Unless people come to Esalen and find a free space to explore. And the overwhelming majority of people who come to Esalen are in social service. And the overwhelming majority of people who come in the orbit of the Dalai Lama and the other great Buddhist teachers in the West, who are having, by the way, the greatest contemplative influence right now. Vedanta, through Vivekananda, had the greatest influence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but now it's the Buddhist influx into the United States and Europe. But the overwhelming majority of them are profoundly involved in social service. We've done many studies. 10,000 people a year come to Esalen. 70% are teachers, social service workers. They're on the front lines of, all the tough stuff. So, God forbid they have a week to learn something about themselves and find an inner spirituality. I think individuals and modern developing worlds are finding a balance and also pushing the frontiers. Some new things are appearing. Sri Aurobindo is a great herald of the new. And one of his greatest works has just been published. It was discovered, his Record of Yoga. It's an astonishing document. I've never seen anything like it in any tradition.
Let's just jump to this, the future of the human body.
Great.
What is the future of the human body?
Well,
you know, we've said that evolution isn't always sort of a linear, progressive, straight line that moves up a graph in a sense.
Right.
What is the future?
All right. There are different scenarios. I don't buy the scenario of the cyborg.
What is your scenario?
Okay. I think, clearly, our gift, every one of our gift for psychosomatic transformation is profound. We know about these spontaneous remission. You don't have to be a Roman Catholic and believe in that and go to Lourdes. These things are happening quite a bit. Spontaneous remissions. We see it in the world of sport. We see it now in the advent of some hundreds of new psychophysical therapies, which help us bring relaxation, concentration, and opening to these secret energies to bear for healing. Now, what I've done in my novels is imagine people who are gifted at this psychophysical transformation. So, for better or for worse, I've put out these images in fiction. I've also done research. I've built up one of the biggest archives in the world of research studies on psychophysical transformation. It's now at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Staggering amount of research on how the body can change. Much of it in the world of sport. How are these athletes doing these prodigies? Well, a lot is learned about this. Now, from this base of lore we inherit from the contemplative traditions and modern research, we can start to glimpse a future. Just as when Isaac Newton wrote the Principia and we had the first laws of physics put together, immediately people were thinking about the technologies that would fall out. Psychotechnologies will come out of this research.
Give us a glimpse of this future.
I don't think there's going to be any thunderclap. I think it's happening now all around us in small ways. You and I talking about these things, we see it's going to be gradual. It's going to be gradual. But I do see that you can take the changes that last for a few minutes and extend them.
We'll come to that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Michael Murphy. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. You were talking about Ramakrishna, and I think one of the exciting, interesting things about Ramakrishna was that there is a documentation, an articulation of the internal processes that he went through, the sadhanas that he went through. And in most cases of this sort of the spiritual experience, there's usually the claim or an articulation of a peak experience, and then the teaching follows, or life's work follows. What makes Ramakrishna special for you?
Well, first of all, the dramatic power of his life and the stupendous beauty of it, because he summed up for an age this capacity to move into the divine, to a union with the divine through these different pathways, 64 tantric disciplines, 5 the grand classic Vaishnava approaches as Radha. He lived for 2 years as Radha,
but
3 months as Hanuman.
But that was a journey. That was grounded in so much pain, anguish, and suffering. So right to the end, he sort of, he was always grasping, yearning for this ultimate union with Ma. So it never really, in some senses, completed itself during his lifetime, in physical form at least.
That's a profound observation.
So
of course, but the moments along the way, I mean, I don't know, maybe you do, of another saint who has been observed in this ecstatic state. I mean, he reputedly was 6 months in almost continuous ecstasy after Totapuri, the Vedantic sadhu put a piece of glass or something in his third eye, and then you have to cut the mother in half. And then he went into this ecstatic state. He was observed, the hair standing on end, bleeding through his pores, but he was, and these photographs of him, the eyewitness testimony, the Katamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, is Aldous Huxley called the greatest up-close biography of a saint ever written. I mean, vivid details. And if you get into the more esoteric part of it, his so-called secret talk, I mean, he was very earthy, so you get a up-close sense of it. So for me, the closer you come to Sri Ramakrishna, the closer you get into his ecstatic field. Yes, it was agony in his moments of his sadhana, but I would argue that he makes ecstasy very, very palpable to students of him.
But doesn't that also sort of teach us something about the journey, what is the role of suffering? Because the Western sensibility, and I don't want to just sort of isolate to the West, let's just say the modern emerging dominant sensibility from, capitalist doctrine in some ways, is is the eradication of suffering, that we can all in some ways be happy, and that suffering is really an impediment and an obstacle, something we just need to sort of sweep aside, either sort of, whether it was sort of popping the kinds of pills in the 60s, which were, LSD, drugs, alternate states of consciousness, or the more modern psychiatric drugs of today.
If we are ever, now here's where I would not have been inspired to change my life by Sri Ramakrishna. I love and admire him, but I was changed by Sri Aurobindo, because Sri Aurobindo had a big evolutionary context. Ramakrishna is this extraordinary flower of these ancient traditions and a bona fide religious genius of the highest order. But Sri Ramakrishna is a herald of the new, puts it in an evolutionary context, and his vision of human transformation, which has influenced me, is that it depends on transformative practice. But he chose what he called the sunlit path. Only necessary suffering. There's unnecessary suffering and necessary suffering. Yes, if you're going to grow, you have to sacrifice. But what does sacrifice mean? Sacrificio, to make sacred.
The other thing you've done is that you have, in our conversation, it's seemingly interchangeably used divine, consciousness, superconsciousness, and a whole range of words. How important, or how crucial is this notion of divine? What do you understand by divine? Sort of creator God? Why is divine?
For me, I was oriented first by Sri Aurobindo because he brought a lot of different metaphysical notions together. First, we have to say that the divine, there is a language about the divine, but the divine is a fact. In the primal sense, Alfred North Whitehead said, it is a fact of existence. But how you and I talk about the divine can vary. But we have the privilege as modern people to have a lot of languages. The Vedanta has, a very sophisticated language. Arguably, there's never been a more sophisticated statement of something like the Isha Upanishad. Isha Vashyam Idam Sarvam. All this is for habitation by the Lord. That moves and that moves not. That is far and the same is near. That is within all this, that is also outside all this. Now you can go through the sutras, the Upanishads. It gives you a prismatic reading that turns you to the different facets of the divine. But that is not, we mustn't mistake the finger that points to the moon. But then I've been reading recently these extraordinary Muslim, Ibn Arabi. No one on this planet has ever done metaphysics with more shimmering lattice work. It's like looking at these gorgeous, like going to the Taj Mahal. It's the Taj Mahal of metaphysics. But it's not the ecstasy of Sri Ramakrishna. I mean, it's a beautiful way in. Ibn Arabi, Plotinus, the Greek, it's so beautiful to read that. So you have to know Greek to really read it. But
so what then becomes...
but this is the language. But that language, now, in California in the 60s, get out of your head and into your senses, Language helps. So let's have the best possible language.
So give us a sense, using your language, as to what your aspiration is. You have been engaged in this movement, in this process for so long, and like Ramakrishna's was union with the mother. For a hatha yogi, it is sort of going through the recesses of of consciousness traveling through every corner of his human form. What is in
Well,
your vocabulary?
Rajiv, I have to, you invite honesty, you know, you're a brilliant questioner. And I have to say it depends who I'm talking to. I guess my favorite language is to talk about it in the language of the everyday. And I'm very partial to the way a lot of Sufis and a lot of Zen teachers talk. It's the way you can look at this flower and suddenly, you know, out of my own limited consciousness, suddenly it tells me, reminds me that all is well, that it's a window into amazing possibilities. In other words, the disclosure of the common everyday is what I first want to say. But I'm also glad that there's this grand language too, which invites me out towards these further reaches of ecstasy that nobody incarnated more brilliantly than Sri Ramakrishna, or talked about more brilliantly than Sri Aurobindo. So both the down-home language that we find in Zen, in Hasidism, you know, in the Talmud, it said, in the wedding bed, there's a foretaste of the life to come. I wrote a book about golf that said that walking down a good green fairway, suddenly it is like God's negligee. You can see this light through it. Golfers have these experiences, but God forbid they do metaphysics.
Thank you very much. This has been a great privilege, a great learning experience for me.
Well, wonderful to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.